Welcome. I'm Anders Fremstad. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Colorado State University, where I teach my Principles of Microeconomics course with CORE's open textbook, The Economy. What I love about teaching microeconomics with the economy is that it starts the semester by exposing students to these hockey stick figures showing how GDP per capita has changed over the last 1,000 years. So my students immediately see that there were hundreds of years, centuries of economic stagnation before the sort of growth we've become accustomed to over the last century or two. It also asks students to consider whether or not capitalism can explain this fantastic economic growth over the last century or two. By naming capitalism, students immediately are drawn to compare and contrast it with other economic systems, including slavery and feudalism, family-based production, socialism. But CORE goes beyond that to precisely define what it is they mean by capitalism, defining it as a system that's based not just around private property and markets, but also around firms, right? That in capitalism, the vast majority of workers are working as wage workers for firms. It's easy for students also to relate this to their own history. Most of them don't know how to go back that many generations to know that their own family members were just barely getting by in the last century or two. In my own case, right, my grandmother in 1910 was living basically in a subsistence farming world. Right? When she immigrated to the United States and ultimately got a job canning salmon on the mouth of the Columbia River, right? That's what transformed her livelihood into that we now see as sort of a middle-class American standard of living, right? And in part, that's about her relationship to capitalism. CORE also, by introducing students these hockey stick figures, gets them to understand that we can see data in many different ways. And in the first chapter, I show my students how we can see these hockey stick figures on both a standard linear scale, as well as a log scale or a ratio scale, and how the actual curves that we're drawing here are actually a collection of data from precise years. We have, of course, much more data more recently than we have centuries ago. I also have my students first week of class work with some data themselves, pick a country using data that CORE provides, and use that data to make their own hockey stick figure on a linear scale, and also on a ratio scale, and also to use the equation to calculate annual growth rates from the first week of class to calculate annual growth rates not just for a single year, but for 1,000 years of data. Introducing students these hockey stick figures also motivates them to want to understand economic theory, to want to understand what could possibly explain centuries of stagnation followed by a few decades or a couple centuries of economic growth. We use this to motivate students to understand production functions, right? And introduce them to the idea of a concave production function, where as you increase the number of farmers, the average product or the amount of food per person is going to decline. Right? We use this to introduce them to Malthus theory, explain why it is that it seemed that incomes were unlikely to grow, and in fact did not grow much for centuries. We also use this historical data to motivate them to understand cost functions facing cloth producers. In the 1600s, if you're producing cloth in Britain, you faced relatively flat isocost curves, right, where it cost quite a bit, where coal was relatively expensive relative to labor. In that world, of course, it was not as economical to use a coal-intensive technology than a labor-intensive technology. In the 1700s, as the cost of coal fell and the relative cost of labor increased, it all of a sudden became cheaper to adopt a more coal-intensive technology. And this is one possible explanation for why the Industrial Revolution, the capitalist revolution, first occurred in Britain. CORE's text introduces students to Bob Allen's work in history, trying to understand the Industrial Revolution there. And it walks them through the data suggesting that, in fact, labor's relative wages, right, were high in a place like Newcastle, England, somewhat high in a city like London, and much lower in a city like Paris or Beijing. By clicking in the book on this link, students can also work with this data themselves to see wages relative to the price of energy in the early 1700s. Finally, what this does is, of course, none of these models provide perfect explanations for the sort of data that history shows us, right? But it does get students immediately engaged in trying to understand the world around them and to engage in discussions with one another about whether or not these economic models help us see more by looking at less, whether or not they explain stagnation or the Industrial Revolution, whether or not the assumptions and models are defensible. This is some of my favorite reasons for teaching core and principles of microeconomics. It excites students because it connects economics to the history, right, and to the economic facts that we're trying to explain with the theories that we already want to teach our students in their intro level course.